5352. The Secretary will read.
Enact relating to vehicular pursuits and amending RCW 10.116.060 be it enacted by the legislature of the state of Washington.
Last
Section
line.
1, manner that endangers the safety of the community or the officer.
Amendments at the desk. Amendment number 0215. The Secretary will read.
Strike everything after the enacting clause and insert the following. Section 1, RCW
Last line.
10. Amending RCW 10.116.060 and declaring an emergency.
Senator Dhingra.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move adoption of striking amendment 0215.
Senator Dhingra moves adoption of striking amendment number 0215. Amendments to the amendment. Amendment number 0218. The Secretary will read.
On page 1, beginning on line 16, after RCW.
Last line.
Offense under RCW 46.61.500.
Senator Gildon.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of amendment number 0218.
Senator Gildon moves adoption of amendment number 0218. Remarks, Senator Gildon.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to start off by talking about an event that happened last week out near Ellensburg on Interstate 9A, and I want to tell you about it because it makes the case for why this particular amendment is so important. At Thorpe exit, the Washington State Patrol encountered a man driving 111 miles per hour. That's 41 miles per hour faster than the stated speed limit for that section of highway. And a patrolman signaled for the driver to stop. He did not. He sped away because under current law, he was unable to give pursuit. Current law states that a few reasons that you're able to pursue, that's that someone's more likely than not a suspect in a violent crime, or they're driving while intoxicated prior to beginning the pursuit. And over the next hour, several other officers also saw that man speeding and weaving through traffic. Again, they signaled for him to stop, and he did not. He kept right on moving. And there's really nothing that they could do, Mr. President. Later, he entered Interstate 82, going the wrong direction, and he ended up smacking head-on into a vehicle, injuring 2 people, and killing 2 others, killing a 6-year-old boy and an 8-year-old girl. Mr. President, that man was absolutely driving recklessly. And if the police had been able to give chase in Ellensburg and stop that man when they had a chance, that could have been prevented, Mr. President. And that's what this amendment is all about. This amendment would restore the ability of law enforcement to pursue a suspect in the case of reckless driving. And reckless driving, it has a legal definition, if I may read.
Please proceed.
Thank you. It says, any person who drives in any vehicle in a willful and wanton disregard for the safety of persons or property is guilty of reckless driving. And it further defines willful and wanton, because that's the key phrase here. Willful means acting intentionally and purposely, and not accidentally and inadvertently. Wanton means acting intentionally in heedless disregard of the consequences and under such surrounding circumstances and conditions that a reasonable person would know or have reason to know that such conduct would, in a high degree of probability, harm a person or property. So basically, willful and wanton means that you know what you're doing is dangerous and you don't really care. Reckless driving is certainly something that we know when we see it, and law enforcement are trained to recognize it, Mr. President. It really, if you're driving down the road, it's those things that say, wow, that looks really dangerous. You know it intuitively. And it could involve actions such as speeding, running through red lights, weaving through traffic, or a combination of these. And most likely it's going to be a combination of those types of behaviors. But it's important to know that people who are driving recklessly, they're putting other people's lives in danger prior to any interaction with law enforcement. I think that's very important to know, that they are putting people in danger before law enforcement has any interaction with them. Police aren't putting people's lives in danger by pursuing someone who's driving recklessly, Mr. President. They're trying to prevent harm. You know, I have to say, if only our law enforcement could have prevented that tragedy, if only they could have given chase and prevented that tragedy, and so many others that have happened over the course of the last few years. Can't imagine. So, as you vote on this particular amendment, Mr. President, I'd ask you to consider, to remember those 2 young children who needlessly lost their lives so very recently, and know that by adopting this amendment, you now have the chance to correct course. And I beg you, Mr. President, please adopt this amendment.
Further remarks? Senator Dhingra.
Thank you, Mr. President. I unfortunately am rising in opposition to this amendment. One of the most dangerous things that happens on our streets are high-speed chases. I cannot tell you how many times our responsible law enforcement officers will call off a chase because they know it is much more dangerous to engage in that vehicle pursuit than not. And it is extremely unfortunate what happened on that incident with the individual driving 110 miles per hour. Does anyone actually believe that if law enforcement had chased them, that the person would have stopped? Or would they have increased their speed to 200 miles per hour, 180 miles per hour, endangering not just the people who lost their lives, but so many more around that entire area? They could have flipped over, they could have crashed into someone. The law enforcement officer's life would be in danger as well. These are things we have to take very, very seriously. A chase escalates what is already happening. It is not a de-escalation situation. This is another example of when you have drone technology, when you have strips where you can actually do some damage to the tires of the vehicle. There are other ways, safer ways, when this can be done. So the issue isn't whether police could chase this person or not. The question here is, would this entire situation have been so much worse if there was a speed? Because I can tell you that person would have put their foot on the pedal and gone faster because they were not going to stop. And that person, it was a driving while intoxicated. And the striking amendment in front of us before changes the standard to reasonable suspicion. There are many ways when you can have a reasonable suspicion of someone that is engaged in a driving while under the influence. One of the factors is speed. The other is if they're wavering, if they go over the lines. Now, I have not read this police report. Based on my experience, the chances are this person was probably wavering. So the question is, was there reasonable suspicion for a DUI? And under the striking amendment, there would be reasonable suspicion for DUI. But this is where we need to make sure our law enforcement officers have the constraint to call off a pursuit instead of creating a much more dangerous situation. So I'm going to ask for a no vote on this amendment.
Further remarks? Senator Short.
Mr. President, rising in support of the good gentleman's amendment. You know, listening to the debate on the floor, nothing in this amendment takes away the ability of the officer to use judgment. Just because this is brought forward and allowed for pursuit under reasonable suspicion doesn't mean the officer is going to use it in every case. It simply allows the officer to use the judgment in a case-by-case basis, which we trust our law enforcement officers to do every day for us, Mr. President. I think this is an amendment that strikes balance, and I would urge its support, and I would ask for a roll call.
Do 1/6 of the members join in the request for a roll call? The request is sustained. Further remarks? Senator Mccune.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd be hard-pressed to tell the family of 2 young children that just died that those 2 lives are okay to lose because others might have died. I just find that completely unacceptable. Given an officer discretion, which they have demonstrated before we changed the law 2 years ago, and I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought there, when we give them the ability to pursue in this amendment when reckless driving is observed. If they feel it's too dangerous, they have the discretion to pull back, and they have done that in the past. And I find it ironic that in this body we passed a bill the other day increasing the penalties for road racing. And good bill, but yet now we're going to say, but you can't pursue them. So what was the point of doing that bill? Because that is reckless endangerment that's being demonstrated by drivers. And my heart goes out to the family of the 6 and 8-year-old that an officer could have used discretion had he or she, I don't know what the situation was, felt that they could have stopped it. But under the current law, they can't. This amendment is reasonable. It doesn't say that they must, but it gives them the authority and the discretion to choose that if they feel that they can safely stop the situation, they can. I'm going to stand with that family and with law enforcement and their discretion to adjudicate these and make our roads safer. Please vote yes.
Further remarks, Senator Padden.
Thank you, Mr. President. You know, during the Law and Justice Committee, we had a hearing not on this bill, but another bill that was a study bill about a pursuit. And we had some excellent testimony from the gentleman from the 44th District who was the sheriff of Snohomish County, was a trooper with the State Patrol for many decades, and he had to make the decisions on these pursuits. He said he had a nickname called the Terminator because most of the pursuits he would not authorize, but occasionally he did. And that's what we got to do. We got to trust the judgment of individuals like that to make this decision, and law enforcement has tightened up their pursuit policies dramatically in the last few years. So I would call into question that things were going to be worse if they pursued this individual who ended up killing 2 little children. I mean, I really don't think it could have got much worse than that. I think they would have had an excellent chance of stopping the individual. And there were a number of law enforcement agencies that were involved that could have helped in this situation. This is what we're crying out for. I mean, things are out of control. Look at the closure at I-5 the other day when the guy was going the wrong way on I-5, just like this other fellow going the wrong way on I-82. So this is an egregious situation that calls out for reasonable response, and adopting this amendment would be a reasonable response. Thank you, Mr. President.
Further remarks, Senator Muzzall.
Thank you, Mr. President. I can't imagine 10 years ago we'd even be having this conversation, let's say. For some reason, we seem to have reached a point in time where we feel it necessary to hold back our law enforcement from having accountability. I guess maybe I have a little different view of that. I've watched the young state patrolmen, I'm related to a couple of them, who have come out of the academy the last couple of years and are wondering why they're doing what they're doing. And I'll explain just a couple of instances. Coming off of Starboard, Conway Hill into the Skagit, over the last 2 weeks, one of the state patrolmen has had 2 drivers not pursued on I-5. One of them was doing 109. One of them was doing at 130 miles an hour, Mr. President. They weren't pursued. They were 2 o'clock in the morning, they were flying up the road. And he couldn't pursue them. I went on a ride along this last fall. This was in the Marysville office in the Everett area. There was an individual eluding. They didn't catch him till the next day. Fortunately, they had cameras in the cars and they could see it. He had eluded twice. They caught him in a 3rd time in a parking lot. Same car, different license plates each time, but they had cameras, so they were able to identify the dents and they were able to identify the driver. They took him in and charged him with 2 eluding. There's there's no accountability. They caught him in a parking lot, but they couldn't pursue him. They went up, hit their lights, he took off. There's no accountability, Mr. President. And if we think that the pursuit is what is leading to these high speeds and these accidents, that's not true. There was a wrong-way driver on I-5 last summer, killed a couple. She had just retired. Turned out she was a workmate of a friend of my wife's. But the worst part, my son-in-law had to go find the family because it killed both the parents and let them know that they were, but they would not have been able to pursue that driver unless they could prove he was intoxicated. The reality is that there are lots of things that lead up to this. Last story the other night, somebody stole a panel truck south of Everett up I-5 again. High rate of speed, couldn't pursue. But they were able to determine there was a couple of things about what he did, gave them the ability to determine that he was intoxicated. Closed off the traffic, caught him at Kincaid Street there in Mount Vernon with spike strips, flattened the tires. He continued on into Mount Vernon, up on the railroad tracks and ran. They never caught the individual, but they got him off the road. But he was at a high rate of speed before anybody ever pursued him. The idea that they're going at this high rate of speed and that they're endangering lives because of being pursued, that isn't the reason they're doing it. But we have to be able to pursue these individuals to get these crazy people off of the highway. And we all see it when we're driving on I-5. You're doing the speed limit and somebody flies past you at 30, 40 miles an hour. We're just supposed to let them go? And this is what this amendment talks to, is identifying these individuals who are driving recklessly and giving them the ability to get them off the road. It isn't about the pursuit. It's about identifying that these are not safe to the rest of the public and they need to be removed. Mr. President, this is a good amendment. We need to let law enforcement do their job, and we need to do our job right now. Thank you, Mr. President.
Further remarks, Senator Wagoner.
Thank you, Mr. President. Rising in support of the amendment. I can't do a better job of explaining the logic than Senator Gildon did, but if you're not convinced by the logic of it, I'd like to talk to the emotional side of this. A few days ago, we had a moment of silence on this floor for the victims of that horrific crash. That was nice, and that was proper, and we all expressed our sympathies and our empathy. But after that moment of silence, what changed? We went back to work and nothing changed. This is our chance to use our power for good and to make a change that may have prevented that accident, which may have prevented our need to have a moment of silence. Let's do something other than have a moment of silence for victims going forward. Let's fix it. Hang this amendment, please.
Further remarks, Senator Braun.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. I rise in strong support of this amendment. You know, there's some bold claims made earlier in this debate. The claim that, you know, if we pursued, they would accelerate to 200 miles an hour, 180 miles an hour. Now, I can only assume this was hyperbole or just a flat-out misunderstanding of the physical possibilities of the chase. Patrol cars don't go that fast, Mr. President. They top out about 155 miles an hour. But more than that, Mr. President, well before they reach that speed for any length of time, almost every department in the state under their own guidance would cease the pursuit. They understand, law enforcement understands what they do is dangerous to themselves, to the folks they're pursuing, and most importantly, to the public they protect. They understand, Mr. President, much more than we do how to do their job. The idea that somehow we can say, or it has been said with certainty, this person wouldn't stop. There's no way to know that. The idea that you could make that claim without even reading the report, I think, is is troubling. Look, Mr. President, we need to slow down. We need to listen to the people who do this job. We need to listen to the citizens of our state that are suffering the consequences. We need to be more humble. We need to seek to understand. This amendment recognizes what folks have been telling us, that we got it wrong. The folks that changed the law in 2021 got it wrong. This bill and this amendment get us back in a better direction. It's as simple, Mr. President. This amendment can save lives. When we're not sure, we should default to saving lives. Please support the amendment.
Further remarks? Senator Wilson Jeff.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. I, too, rise in support of this amendment. I have two reasons. Timothy Escamilla, age 6, and Delilah Minishu, age 8. Thank you, Mr. President.
Further remarks? Senator Dozier.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise in support of this amendment. During our break here, before we came back to the floor, I reached out to law enforcement in the Tri-Cities and in Walla Walla that I represent. I talked to them personally about the potential of this bill maybe coming up today and what I thought they might need in it. We talked about pursuit. And what one of the police chiefs told me from the Tri-Cities was, these people have gotten so brazen, their officers sit there and they race by them. As we heard, these officers are trained. They don't want any lives to be hurt. I can't imagine the state troopers that watch that car scream by at over 100 miles an hour, what they feel like inside their hearts, knowing that they could not pursue that individual. And in less than 2 hours, that same car killed 2 young children. That car drove. I drive that trip every single weekend going home. If that car was on that freeway, they could have contacted other law enforcement that could have been down the road a ways to try to stop that driver before he got off and went the wrong way and hit somebody head on. Not only did those 2 lives, those 2 children die, those officers also probably have a lot of hurt in their hearts knowing that they could not pursue.
Further remarks? Senator Holy.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. This is a lot of different things going through my mind all at the same time. It's not an academic discussion. It's not a philosophical perspective. It's growing up and being really young and owning GTOs and Corvettes back when it was probably unprudent for me to own those cars, and knowing full well that if you're caught racing, that you get pulled over and you get a reckless driving ticket. Or if you ran from the police and they caught you, which the odds were in your favor a lot, that you might get booked for reckless driving. Nonetheless, it was reckless driving. This body, during the first special session, 1979, finally came to its senses, addressing the potential for damage and injury and catastrophe resulting from this incentivizing bad behavior, passed a bill that established felony eluding, enabled September 2nd, 1979. And at that point, running from the police became a felony. They actually understood the nature of how, if you're successful at bad behavior, you reinforce the bad behavior and further or worse bad behavior would result. I'm looking at this issue and 40 years in law enforcement, and I'm not hypothetically know anything about running from the police, but as 22 years as a police officer, I know a lot about chasing people as a police officer too. It's very, very, very rare that you see all 4 corners representing law enforcement, Criminal Justice Training Commission, the Association of Sheriffs and Police Chiefs, Washington Council of Police and Sheriffs, which is a labor organization, and the fraternal organization, Fraternal Order of Police, a national organization, sizes akin to Teamsters, all lining up on the same side of an issue and telling us when we established this bill, limiting pursuits, I wouldn't do that if I were you. They understood the nature of the consequences of what we're doing. I realized that this bill not even getting a hearing in committee was rather interesting, in that having all of these issues come up here in the last 2 weeks or month, where because of failing to pursue or using a pursuit intervention technique or boxing people in, or all the tactics they teach you, that people are dead. And I almost wish we could do the metrics to figure out how many people have died in the course of crashes during pursuits versus what we've lost just in the last month here as a result of not having pursuits. I think the numbers would be more than convincing that we need to have a reasonable pursuit policy. Reckless driving is something that's an indicator of, by definition, a willful and wanton disregard for the safety or property of others when you look it up with RCW. My screen died. If you give me a moment, I'd like permission to read from the Spokane Police Department pursuit policy, a couple of brief excerpts prior to 2019.
Please proceed.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. Say officers shall at all times consider the following factors individually and collectively in deciding whether to initiate or continue a pursuit. A, the importance of protecting the public and balancing the known or reasonably suspected offense and the apparent need for immediate capture against the risks to officers, innocent motorists, and others. That's number one. Remember, this is all before we had the pursuit bill. These policies have been established, I can pretty well remember, all the way back to about 2000. The apparent nature of the fleeing suspects, whether they represent a serious threat to public safety. C, the safety of the public in the area of pursuit, including the type of area, type of day, etc. D, the pursuing officer's familiarity with the area of pursuit, the quality of radio communications, dispatch, the driving capabilities of the pursuing officers, and the conditions of the pursuit. This continues almost to break down every possible analytical aspect you could bring talking about controlling pursuits. And on top of that, departmental policy was you immediately had a supervisor go to dispatch, and he would monitor all this. And if he saw something, and maybe you got a little bit wrapped up in what you're doing, he would terminate the pursuit. The checks and balances were so great as to prevent the problems that we're addressing here, trying to address by having this underlying bill that we found out is ineffective, and it's not doing what we need to do. If anything, it's becoming more lethal. Going all the way back to something as simple as people being successful with bad behavior, and that success breeding confidence and bringing further bad behavior or worse behavior. We're seeing anecdotal stories brought in on a daily basis about people speeding, about possibly and it's hearsay, the person at Fort Lewis yesterday, where we had the freeway closed for hours, had pulled over several times and waited for the police to catch up in order to aggravate them and initiate the pursuit again. There are so many things out there that people are actually doing that are a typical response of the type of person that would engage in this kind of behavior to that ambient knowledge that gets around really, really quickly about what the police can, what they can't do, what the limitations are, what their policies are. Mr. President, this isn't just a Republican ploy or an attempt to make the bill better for a talking point. This is something that is so dramatically necessary in the course of what we've seen over the last month that I can't think of the thought of not having a little bit more latitude with these major checks and balances that have been in place for 20 years that are also in the underlying bill attempting to memorialize, but it's a restatement of what exists. The bad behavior has attempted to be controlled to such an extent that a large majority of pursuits are called off for the very reasons I mentioned. We should support this amendment.
Further remarks, Senator McCune.
Thank you, Mr. President. Well, this is definitely a reasonable amendment, and I thank the senator from 25th for bringing it forward, and I stand in strong support of it. Reasonable suspicion of a person inside the vehicle committed a reckless driving. Pretty simple. What's happening in our communities across the state is police officers are retiring because we're not making strong laws. They're not only retiring, we can't get them ones to hire. And so we're over 40 officers just in Pierce County alone, down, not including corrections officers. So this is causing just a mass mess across the state. And this is just a really reasonable amendment. Reckless driving. I think we need to adopt this amendment, Mr. President. It's an important amendment. Thank you.
If there are no further remarks, the question before the Senate is adoption of amendment number 0218. The request for roll call was sustained. The Secretary will call the roll.
Billig. Binky. Braun. Cleveland. Conway. Dhingra. Dozier. Fortunado. Frame. Gildon. Hasagawa. Hawkins. Holy. Hunt. Kaufman. Kaiser. King. Kuderer. Leas. Lovelet. Lovick. Mccune Drew. Mccune Jim. Mullet. Muzzall. Wen. Nobles. Padden. Peterson. Randall. Rivers. Robinson. Rolfes. Saldana. Solomon.
No.
Chesler. Shoemake.
No.
Short. Stanford. No. Torres. Trudeau. Valdez. Vandeweghe. Wagoner. Warnick. Wellman. Wilson Clare. Wilson Jeff. Wilson Lynda. Mr. President, there are 20 yea, 29 nay.
Having failed to receive a majority vote, the amendment is not adopted. Further amendments, amendment number 0219, the Secretary will read.
On page 1, beginning on line through vehicle offense under RCW 98.56.065.
Senator Padden.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that Amendment 0219 be adopted.
Senator Padden moves for adoption of amendment number 0219. Remarks, Senator Padden.
Thank you, Mr. President. This amendment simply permits an officer to engage in a vehicle pursuit following proper policy, of course. If the officer has reasonable suspicion a person inside the vehicle has committed or is committing theft of that motor vehicle. We discussed earlier in the day the funding of the auto theft task force, and we had some amazing statistics. Last year, Mr. President, in our state in 2022, there were over 45,000 vehicle thefts. And that has gone up dramatically from 2019. We were 9th in the country, and then in 2020, we were 8th, and then in 2021, 6th, and now in 2022, 4th. So you can see the trajectory that we're headed in. And each one of these vehicles is stolen has a victim, at least one victim. Sometimes, Mr. President, when these are stolen, they are used to commit further crimes, and there's other victims involved. They might steal the car and then go rob someplace or do other acts that of criminal activity. This has become, a major problem in our state, and there also is a tremendous economic cost, not just for the auto dealers, used auto dealers, new auto dealers, but all the individuals. We heard the story of the son of the gentlelady from the 18th district and how that has impacted that individual and the ability to get to work and get around. We are dependent to a large degree in a large part of our states on the use of automobiles. So this is something, in fact, just in King and Pierce County in January, 81 automobiles are stolen every single day, So, I mean, we're going to be leading the nation the way we're going right now unless we take some action. And if we were to allow the pursuit for auto theft, that would help a lot in reducing the number of auto thefts, and the word would get out. I mean, right now, as has been indicated earlier, the criminal element knows that police can't pursue them. We even had an incident, Mr. President, in Spokane where a guy called in to the police saying, hey, looks like somebody from the police is chasing me. They're not allowed to do that. I mean, this is nuts, in my opinion. Urge your support of the amendment. Thank you.
Further remarks, Senator Dhingra.
Thank you, Mr. President. Rising in opposition to this amendment, I always love hearing statistics and data being used on the floor, because I think it's really important for us to be data-driven, evidence-based. While motor vehicle thefts have been rising, that rise began in 2020, 18 months before the law changed, and the same increases have been seen in Oregon and California, in states that have not changed their pursuit policy. That's data. Vehicle rates vehicles being stolen, those rates consistently track used car prices. That is what drives car thefts, not vehicle pursuit policies. The issue here is protecting human life or protecting property. That is the analysis that we have to do when we're taking a look at this amendment. Since 2015, 30 people in the state of Washington have been killed in high-speed chases. Nearly half of them were innocent bystanders or passengers. National numbers that are less up to date, but between 1890 and 2015, 11,500 people were killed in police pursuits. 5,000 of them were passengers or bystanders. If I may quote from a headline from the Washington Post, Mr. President.
Please proceed.
Police chases kill more people each year than floods, tornadoes, hurricanes, and lightning combined. Just a few months ago, actually I'm not even sure I can say months instead of just a month ago, in Seattle, there was a college student crossing the street in the crosswalk, minding her own business, and was killed by a law enforcement officer responding to a call. She's just going to college, minding her own business, and she is dead because of the high speed with which that law enforcement officer was driving. She's in the crosswalk. Yes, stolen cars are horrible, and we should make sure that those individuals are prosecuted. But you cannot do it at the expense of people being killed. I'm going to ask for a no on this amendment.
Further remarks, Senator Short.
Thank you, Mr. President. Rising in support of the gentleman's amendment. You know, regardless of when these vehicle thefts started to increase, not adopting this amendment continues to needlessly tie law enforcement's hands. And yes, life is paramount. But you tell that to a person or a family who is struggling to get by, who is struggling to pay their bills, and they're dealing with the loss of a vehicle. Someone has come and stolen their vehicle. Those are big deals to our families. The thousands of dollars that it takes to, you know, to replace a vehicle that people use to get their kids back and forth to school, to go back and forth between their jobs. But there's one important thing, Mr. President. The gentleman, so while we're talking data, and we want to make sure that this is a data-driven description and discussion, the gentleman from the 6th quoted from the city, from the Spokane Police Department of how critical, how many things they're looking at to determine whether or not to do that pursuit. You know, and to me, we need to get back. We need to get back to trust that our law enforcement friends, and they are friends, Mr. President, have the training, they have the professional judgment. They don't want to risk civilians' lives. You heard it in the information that the good gentleman from the 6th read. Straight from the city of Spokane's, you know, their what they do, how they determine, how they triage a situation. They have it there. They're entrusted with protecting our safety in our communities, in our neighborhoods, in our businesses, Mr. President. And to me, we know that the original bill went too far to take away these tools. This bill, this amendment, brings things back into balance. It restores tools that our communities desperately want our law enforcement officers to have, Mr. President. Regardless of where you live in the state of Washington, it still allows professional judgment. This amendment does not force a law enforcement's hands. It allows that professional judgment to take place. That's what this amendment does. I urge its support, and I'd ask for a roll call.
Do 1/6 of the members join in the request for a roll call? The request is sustained. Further remarks? Senator Trudeau.
Thank you, Mr. President. I appreciate the remarks on this, but I want to take us back to what this amendment presents us, which I believe is a false choice, and that is the idea that a vehicle being stolen is more important than the individual going across the crosswalk or playing on the sidewalk, or like many neighborhoods in my community, they don't have sidewalks to play on, so they literally play in the street, which puts them at disproportional danger. It's not about the intention of the law enforcement officer. I don't think any of us would assume that any of them would want something bad to happen while they are pursuing an individual. Absolutely not. I think that's one thing that there is great consensus here. We are not accusing individual officers of any malintent. But I think when we look at situations like car theft, and I'll speak a little bit about my own experiences, Mr. President. I've had my car stolen, and it sucks. And I was working a low-wage job, and I had to figure it out. And it was before the law changed. This was the situation I was in. I was told by law enforcement that there really wasn't much they could do that I would have to wait until maybe it turned up or something else happened. There was no conversation about whether someone was going to pursue. But what I can tell you, Mr. President, in my heart, is that if I had a choice between preserving the life of an individual in a crosswalk or on the corner or on the sidewalk playing in the street versus getting my car back, I would give up my car every single day. And that's what I think that we need to focus on, is what are we pitting against each other? The sanctity of human life versus a vehicle. And I would just offer that the changes that, you know, the process in terms of pursuing stolen vehicles, as I mentioned, there was no, I had to wait it out. But I would wait it out and never get my car back so that somebody else's life could be preserved. And I thank you, Mr. President.
Further remarks, Senator Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. President. So a little bit earlier today, we had a bill that was to fund this account that will help with the pursuit of stolen cars, because we have skyrocketing stolen cars, and particularly in Clark County is one of the highest. And I mean, it's not uncommon to have a car stolen twice, your same car stolen twice. But I just heard something that said what we can do to preserve a life. And right now, there is a little girl up there in that gallery that has no sister. Because right after this law went into effect, a car was stolen, and that car hit and killed her sister. Her name was Immaculate. Her mother, Amber, is up there. When you talk about preserving a life, what is she thinking right now? Because her daughter is gone. Let's think about preserving her life. We talk about how many cars are stolen in this state. 45,000 a year. That's 45,000 chances that this could happen again. Pierce and King County, 81 cars a day, 81 times that this could happen again. We cannot keep letting this happen. We have drugs this all is so connected. We have drugs, we have criminals out there, we have stolen guns out there that we need to be doing something about. We've got to do something. And I'm sure that Amber and her sister and the little girl's sister would really appreciate it if we did that today. Thank you.
Further remarks, Senator Gildon.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I'd just like to add on to the remarks from the previous speaker, because that incident actually happened in my district. Someone broke into a construction yard, stole the vehicle. Police weren't able to pursue, and tragedy happened after the vehicle theft. And that's why this is so important, Mr. President, because if we disallow justice, if we disallow law enforcement to do their jobs, we will have more accidents, more injuries, and more deaths. This amendment does not put property over people. This amendment puts people on a high level. Mr. President, I ask you to support this amendment.
Further remarks, Senator Fortunado.
Thank you, Mr. President. I will point out that carjackings, in effect, are a stolen vehicle. When we talk about preserving human life, we protect about our most treasured possessions, which are our children. How would you like to be a mother or a father and have a car carjacked with your child in the back seat in a car seat, and that police officer not be able to pursue that vehicle? Some of the comments that we heard talk about, again, trying to put property over life, insinuating that a police officer would not have the discretion to pursue in the case of a dangerous situation. As I recall, there was an inquiry about this recent accident yesterday, and yesterday they...
Senator Dhingra, for what purpose do you rise?
Done.
Please proceed, Senator Fortunado.
So yesterday, as I understand it, it was inquired as how come this guy wasn't pursued, and I believe that the State Patrol said they broke it off because it was too dangerous to pursue. Those officers made the decision not to pursue because it was too dangerous. We are taking away their discretion on being able to pursue these vehicles. And again, it goes on the assumption that the police officer is not going to have that discretion. If they see a car being stolen, those people that steal cars don't take that car and then drive the speed limit. They take off like a shot, Mr. President. And I know at one time there was a guy who just went to the grocery store. And every day I kiss my wife goodbye because you never know, hey, might be the last time we ever see you. I go to the grocery store, I come out, some guy comes flying over the center island through a bunch of bushes and just barely misses me. And this was, and he wasn't even being pursued. He was just, I guess he was taking a stolen vehicle. So not being able to pursue those and not giving that discretion to law enforcement really takes it away and endangers the public. We're not talking about protecting human life. We're talking about endangering many more human lives than we are attempting to protect. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator Dhingra.
Mr. President, I apologize for that. I just assumed he was done. I would just want to make sure we're clear. Kidnapping is a violent offense. You can pursue for kidnapping. Carjacking, you can pursue for that. It's very important that we actually have our facts straight when dealing with such important issues about what is covered, what isn't covered, in what circumstances pursuits can happen. And when you're reducing the standard from probable cause to reasonable suspicion, there's a lot of activities that are included in that, especially when that standard is used on suspicion of a DUI. So I know that people get very emotional and really go deep into those emotions, but I would always like to bring us back to the facts, and the facts are that under the striking amendment, there are a lot of instances when pursuits can occur, and so it's important for us to understand that. Again, kidnapping, you can pursue. Carjacking, you can pursue.
Further remarks, Senator Wilson Jeff.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise in support of the good senator's amendment proposal from the 4th District, and why we're talking about reasonable suspicion. Every day, Mr. President, every single day in Washington State, we deal with unreasonable actions. 123 vehicles are stolen every single day, Mr. President. That's somebody's lifeline to employment. That's getting somebody to school. That's allowing us to have our everyday lives. I don't find that unreasonable. In fact, what I find unreasonable is the message that we're currently sending, that you can steal another person's car. We've emboldened those people. Steal the car. You won't be chased. It's pretty simple to me, Mr. President, and I'd like to offer up that it's our opportunity as a legislative body to correct this. It's okay. We can correct this. We can put some common sense back in, Mr. President. We can send a clear message, a very clear message, to those that would like to commit this crime, that they can be pursued. We've heard a lot today. It doesn't mean that they will be pursued, but we at the very least, must restore the option that you could be pursued. And I'd hope that that would happen more often, Mr. President. Please support this amendment.
Further remarks, Senator Mccune.
Thank you, Mr. President. Taking off of that a bit, what does the message send under our current law? It emboldens criminals. We're talking about a felony here. And you cannot pursue a suspected felon that steals a vehicle? I had one stolen a couple months ago, and in speaking with the Mason County Sheriff's deputy. I probably made some comments that I probably shouldn't have, along the lines of, it's a good thing I didn't catch the guy. And the deputy said to me, he goes, I know. He goes, we hear that all the time because we can't do anything about it. The message that the current law sends is that we're not going to pursue you. You can commit a felony. We're not going to do anything about it. This amendment simply corrects it. And again, do we or do we not trust the professional discretion of our law enforcement community? I do. This doesn't say that they must, but if in their discretion they think it's safe enough to do so, they will. And to suggest that this is choosing a vehicle over a life, I just find appalling, because I don't believe there's a single officer in this state that would choose to put another life in danger over a stolen vehicle. I just don't believe that to be the case. My son was discharged from the Marine Corps in 2018, a decorated Marine Corps law enforcement officer. He returned to his home state here. I encouraged him to go into law enforcement, and he didn't want to. And you know why? He told me, because I won't be able to do my job. Let's adopt this amendment, Mr. President. Thank you.
If there are no further remarks, the question before the Senate is the motion to adopt amendment number 219. The request for a roll call was sustained. The Secretary will call the roll.
Billig. Binky. Braun. Cleveland. Conway. Dhingra. Dozier. Fortunado. Frame. Gildon. Asagawa. Hawkins. Holy. Hunt. Kaufman. Kaiser. King. Kuderer. Leas. Lovelet. Lovick. Mccune Drew. Mccune Jim. Mullet. Muzzall. Wen. Nobles. Padden. Peterson. Randall. Rivers. Robinson. Rolfes. Saldana. Solomon.
No.
Chesler. Shoemake. Short. Stanford. Torres. Trudeau. Valdez. Vandaway. Wagoner. Warnick. Wellman. Wilson Claire. Wilson Jeff. Wilson Lynda. Mr. President, there are 20 yea, 29 nay.
Having failed to receive a majority of vote, the amendment is not adopted. Further amendments, amendment number 0220, the Secretary will read.
On page 1, beginning on line 16, after
Last
RCW,
line.
strike all material, movement.
Senator Short.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of Amendment 220.
Senator Short moves adoption of amendment number 0220. Remarks, Senator Short.
Thank you, Mr. President. Appreciate the efforts of the striking amendment to describe violent offenses, and I think it includes so many, heinous offenses. But the thing that I got to thinking about, and the subject of the amendment, is it should it broaden it so that it really gives the law enforcement officers, the ability to make the professional judgment they need to determine what those violent offenses are. And Mr. President, I would like to highlight a few offenses that are not part of this bill and are the subject of my amendment. Mr. President, might I read?
Please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. President. Reckless endangerment. A person is guilty of reckless endangerment when he or she recklessly engages in contact not amounting to drive-by shooting, but that creates a substantial risk of death or serious physical injury to another person. Endangerment, it's a gross misdemeanor, Mr. President. That is not something that could be the subject of reasonable suspicion under our pursuit policy being described in the striking amendment. The second one is criminal mistreatment in the first degree. A parent of a child, the person entrusted with the physical custody of a child or dependent person who's assumed the responsibility to provide the basic necessities of life, causes great bodily harm to a child or dependent person by withholding basic necessities of life. Class B felony, Mr. President. That actually is not in the striking amendment as the subject of reasonable suspicion of law enforcement to be able to pursue. The third one that I'll read, Mr. President, assault of a child in the third degree. A person 18 years of age or older is guilty of the crime of assault of a child in the third degree if the child is under the age of 13 and the person commits the crime of assault in the third degree as defined. Also a Class C felony. I do appreciate how many things have been put into the striking amendment, Mr. President. But to me, and the reason for the amendment, which statutorily is in our statutes, Mr. President, that broadens it to the point where our law enforcement has that professional judgment. We don't want to say that it's okay to pursue in these instances under reasonable suspicion, but somebody suffers reckless endangerment, assault of a child, criminal mistreatment. What is that saying to the victims, Mr. President? What is it saying to the victims where timing is everything, where the amount of time it might take to apprehend someone who committed this crime takes longer because maybe the police officer was not able to pursue that person who committed that crime in a timely manner? We continue to re-victimize the victims. Time is something that is so critical when someone has been the subject of a violent act, Mr. President. We know that. We do so much work in this body on sexual assault and other things that we know that to help the victim, we need to do things in as expeditiously amount of time as possible in order not to just cause them greater harm and grief, Mr. President. And I think establishing a definition that really gives them that flexibility, those law enforcement officers, is really where we should go with this bill. And I would urge its support and ask for a roll call. Thank you.
216 of the members join in the request for a roll call. The request is sustained. Further remarks, Senator Dhingra.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would actually like to speak about the amendment in front of us today, and I'm going to ask for no vote. If I may read from the amendment, Mr. President. Okay, so there are two parts of this amendment, and I'm going to take the last part first. So it says, or any act exerted upon a person's body to compel, constrain, or restrain the person's movement. That's kidnapping. That's covered under the striking. Now, going to the first part of this amendment, it says, any offense that involves an act that is reasonably likely to cause physical pain or injury. It doesn't say that it has indeed caused physical pain or injury. It's an anticipatory act that might cause physical pain or injury. I'm not even quite sure how you would train someone to chase on an act that is in anticipation of likely to cause physical pain or injury. I understand what the sponsor of this amendment might be trying to get to, but this language is not it. I'm going to ask for a no vote.
There are no further remarks. The question before the Senate is the motion to adopt amendment number 0220. The request for a roll call was sustained. The Secretary will call the roll.
Gildon. Binky. Braun. Cleveland. Conway. Dhingra. Dozier. Fortunado. Frame. Gildon. Hasagawa. Hawkins. Holy. Hunt. Kaufman. Kaiser. King. King. Kuderer. Leas. Lovelet. Lovick. Mccune Drew. Mccune Jim. Mullet. Muzzall. Wen. Nobles. Nobles. Padden. Peterson. Randall. Rivers. Robinson. Rolfes. Saldana. Solomon.
No.
Chesler. Shoemake. Short. Stanford. Torres. Trudeau. Valdez. Vandeweghe. Wagoner. Warnick. Wellman. Wilson Claire. Wilson Jeff. Wilson Lynda.
Senator King, how do you vote? Senator King votes aye.
Mr. President, there are 20 yea, 29 nay.
Having failed to receive a majority, the amendment is not adopted. Question before the Senate is adoption of striking amendment 0215. Remarks, Senator Dhingra.
Thank you, Mr. President. So the striking amendment in front of us does a few things. It changes the standard for when a law enforcement officer may engage in a vehicle pursuit from probable cause to reasonable suspicion. That is one of the lowest thresholds that we have in the legal system. So it says that a law enforcement officer may engage in a vehicle pursuit if they have reasonable suspicion that a violent crime has occurred, whether a vehicle assault offense has occurred, any domestic violence assault has occurred. That's assault 4, 3, 2, 1, all of those. Any domestic violence assault has occurred, or an escape has occurred. And then, of course, it maintains the reasonable suspicion standard for a driving while under the influence. The other things that this bill does is that it does change from saying that the person, instead of posing an imminent threat to the safety, to a serious risk of harm. And it makes some amendments to what's required in terms of, changes it from requiring approval from a supervisor to informing the supervisor that the pursuit is occurring. It does require that right when the pursuit starts, that officers come up with a plan on how they're going to end the pursuit. And this is where it's really important. The reason why we have that in there is because we need to move to 21st century policing. We have to change to make sure we're using technology to police our state so that it's safe for everybody. I do have to commend the Redmond Police Department for using star chasers and using that as a way to end pursuits. That is one of the options that can be utilized under what's in the striker. It also enables the use of drone technology to end pursuits, as Spokane has used. So it has that paragraph in there that says that they have to come up with a plan on how to end the pursuit. And this is where it's really important that we embrace 21st century policing instead of continuing to do things the way they have always been done, which does and has been endangering lives. It also has a it has a training requirement so that the officers who are engaging in that pursuit have the most updated training so that this can be done in a effective manner. And so I'm going to ask support for the striking amendment. And I'll just say that no one wants people to be hurt. We want our law enforcement officers to protect the public. We want them to protect everyone in the public. And unfortunately, that has not been the case. And that's why a lot of these bills were done through the legislation, is because the judgment that was being used needed to be adjusted. And hopefully, with this striking amendment, there will be that pause to use that judgment in a way that truly is for the benefit of the public in ensuring that everyone is safe. I ask for adoption of this amendment. Thank you.
Further remarks, Senator Padden.
Thank you, Mr. President. While there are some parts of this amendment that are admirable, I really get the feeling by this, rather than adopting the amendments that were offered to the striking amendment, we're in effect continuing to micromanage our law enforcement agencies across the state. I mean, you heard in great detail the remarks of the gentleman from the 6th District of what the policy is with the Spokane Police Department and similar policies throughout the state. In addition, they've been tightened up. I indicated in my previous remarks testimony we had from the gentleman from the 44th District in the Law and Justice Committee, how he was a terminator and how the policy they had and how tight it was. But at some point, law enforcement has to do their job, and they have to be able to pursue these folks. In addition, they're very much concerned about liability issues. So all these things are causing them to have a policy, and as others have said, I think we ought to trust our law enforcement folks. It's very disappointing that the felony auto theft amendment did not pass, because that is an epidemic in our state, and we heard very moving testimony. By not passing it, we're putting lives in danger. We're emboldening criminals. And we've seen that in our state with the crime so high, especially, well, throughout the state, but especially in some of our big cities where businesses are leaving downtown cores and people are moving out of the cities. So while there are some positive things here, I cannot support the amendment.
There are no further remarks. The question before the Senate is adoption of the striking amendment, number 0215. Remote members are reminded to raise their hands to indicate their vote. All those in favor of the amendment signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no. No. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it. The amendment is adopted. Senator Lovick.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I move that engross Senate Bill 5352. I move that the rules be suspended, that engrossed Senate Bill 5352 be advanced to third reading, the second reading considered the third, and the bill be placed on final passage.
Senator Lovick moves that the rules be suspended and that engrossed Senate Bill 5352 be advanced to third reading, second reading considered the third, and the bill be placed on final passage. Hearing no objection, so ordered. Engrossed Senate Bill 5352 on third reading and final passage. Remarks, Senator Lovick.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. And Mr. President, this has been a very interesting debate. The one thing that I've learned from this debate is when I testify in front of committee, especially if Senator Padden is there, I better be careful what I say, because I realize that he used to be a judge and he doesn't forget things very, very easily. But, Mr. President, I want to start by thanking Senator Dhingra for her leadership. She has explained the bill very, very well, and I know this is a difficult decision for most members, but I'm going to be asking for a yes vote. And I heard someone mention the word culture, and one of the things that we would say often in law enforcement was that culture eats strategy for breakfast, and you can figure that one out. But, Mr. President, I once heard a member of the California Assembly say that some laws get passed out of hope, and some laws get passed out of fear. Today, Mr. President, I'm voting for hope. I hope that this legislation will bring our community together. I hope that this legislation will strike a balance and give our fantastic peace officers the tools they need to do their job to the best of their ability. I also recognize, Mr. President, that legislation like this will cause fear. And when I say fear, Mr. President, I'm talking about fear in the communities of color. I like to tell my colleagues, especially my good friend, Senator Leas here, that I'm black, I'm brown, and I'm blue. I'm a black man from birth. My skin tone is brown, but I wore the blue uniform proudly for 31 years as a state trooper. And I know without a doubt the great, great work the men and women in law enforcement do. So, Mr. President, with that, I know there are fears out there, but I think legislation like this can bring our community together and help our professionals, our law enforcement professionals, do the job that they are hired and that they are trained to do. I would encourage a yes vote. And thank you, Mr. President. And I also want to thank the members for this debate. I always sit back here and I say to myself, in this business, you learn, you listen, you learn, you help, and then you lead. I think this gives all of us the opportunity to lead. Thank you, Mr. President.
Further remarks? Senator Rivers.
Thank you, Mr. President. Rising in support of this bill and the efforts that have been shown by all of the individuals who have worked on it. You know, I can't drive. As you know, I drive all the way up from southwestern Washington, and I've been stunned by the behaviors of other drivers. And I think to myself that in this instance, I cannot let perfection be the enemy of good, because candidly, anything is better than what we have now. Do I wish we were giving more discretion to our law enforcement partners? I do. We're not there yet, and maybe when we see how this works, this sort of the next step in this grand experiment, maybe we'll get there. But it is my hope that with this action today, we start back on the path of safety in automobiles and changes in attitudes that have allowed people to engage in activities in their vehicles that are so unsafe. I know not everyone on my side of the aisle is going to support this. And we all are coming, every single one of us in this body, Mr. President, come from a very different place. And that's okay. We're going to make decisions based on our personal experiences and on the values that we have. And that's okay. But for my part, while I think this bill may be not as adequate as I would like, I think it's as good as we're going to get for now, and so I'm going to urge a yes vote. Thank you.
Further remarks? Senator Mullet.
Thank you, Mr. President. I do stand in support, and I think, Mr. President, you can appreciate, I think human nature says one of the hardest things in life to do is admit when you've made a mistake. And I voted for this bill back in 2021 And I think the data that I saw at the time was there was a lot of communities throughout our state that had very restrictive pursuit policies, even more restrictive than the one we're voting on today. But I think the unintended consequence, Mr. President, was that the criminals didn't have an Excel spreadsheet that explained what the pursuit policy was in every single jurisdiction. So at the time, even though there was a lot of restrictive pursuit policies, officers weren't dealing with people just driving away when they were pulled over. I think the unintended consequence, Mr. President, of our legislation in 2021 was that it became widely known that we were not going to pursue criminals. That has created a public safety challenge in the state of Washington. That is a reality we are trying to help fix today. And in the 5th Legislative District, we have a variety of communities. I will say Renton is part of that district, and it's the district that has the highest portion of minority residents out of all the districts, cities I represent. It's the mayor of Renton who feels most passionately out of the districts that I represent around getting this fixed. He understands the importance of public safety for his community, and he feels what we have in this underlying bill is actually a good step forward towards fixing some of these problems. And I think we heard from our colleagues, I don't think any of us are claiming that this is a perfect bill to solve all of the issues. But what I feel 100% confident of, Mr. President, is this is better than what we have today on the books. And you've been in this business longer than I have. Public policy is about making incremental progress. And in this bill, we are making incremental progress on public safety in the state of Washington. I encourage everyone's support.
Further remarks, Senator Wagoner.
Thank you, Mr. President. And to Senator Lovick's comments about fear versus hope, in the military, we say hope is not a method. And the reason we say that is because it's true. It's not a method. Today, we turned down 3 opportunities to put method against just hope. Reckless driving, that was an opportunity. Vehicle theft, an opportunity. Senator Short's amendment to include other heinous crimes, an opportunity. 45,000 automotive thefts a year. That's 45,000 families that are primarily affected that today we're saying, yeah, it's too bad. We don't really care enough to put teeth into a bill. But there's secondary effects. Senator Rolfes this morning got it right. When a vehicle is stolen, it doesn't just affect the family directly, it affects the entire neighborhood. 45,000 times a year, neighborhoods don't feel safe. This doesn't go far enough. I'm sorry, I cannot support this bill today.
Further remarks, Senator Trudeau.
Thank you, Mr. President. I've mentioned before on this floor how much I believe in policy rooted in data and facts. I've also shared a lot of personal stories that reflect how much I also believe in love, hope, family, and humanity. In my humble opinion, I think that we do need to be emotionally responsive to issues, but we also need to be honest with ourselves when we're letting emotions overlook the issues on the ground, the facts on the ground. Some of the examples and the stories that were provided here today are absolutely heartbreaking, but many of them, when you dig a little bit deeper, don't actually line up with the policy recommendations that have been used to support some of the amendments or support for the underlying bill. If I may, Mr. President, I'd like to offer a little bit of data from my own county.
Please proceed.
Thank you. I live in the city of Tacoma. City of Tacoma has had a restrictive pursuit policy similar to what we have passed in state law well before state law changed. The city of Fife has banned pursuits. Let me tell you about the city of Lakewood. And I don't mean to pick on the city of Lakewood, but I think it's a good example. There was the Pierce County Council requested an audit, Mr. President, and that's the data that I'm offering today. Before the law changed, there were 66 pursuits tracked with a 35% arrest rate, 38% accident rate, and 9% injury rate. After we passed the law, The pursuits actually increased, 306 pursuits, Mr. President. 9.8 resulted in arrest, 10% accident rate, so 38% to 10% in the accident rate, pre and post the law change, 9% to 3% from before and after the law changed. These are percentages, Mr. President, but these are people impacted. This is property damage. This is individuals that are impacted, innocent bystanders. And so when you see where the accidents and the injury rates don't line up with the purpose of why we've allowed pursuits, I think we really have to have an honest conversation with ourselves. And I want to also say, I am so sorry for every victim of crime. I am so sorry. And I think I speak for every member on this body. Nobody wants that. I myself, Mr. President, come from a family of crime victims. I'm a mother, and I have 2 small children. A block away from my home last summer, I watched a fatal accident occur because people were speeding in our neighborhood, an urban neighborhood. I was taking a video, actually, of my son while the accident happened. That's because we don't have all of the infrastructure necessary. We don't have stop signs. I'm petitioning the city for that. But it creates a dangerous situation. And to say that we don't care about what happens if a vehicle is stolen and somebody is harmed by that, that is disingenuous. Absolutely we care. This policy has weighed heavy, heavy on my heart since we first were discussing it in committee. But I think there's many victims that we're ignoring in the conversation, those percentage points, those individuals. I know that any victim of crime, me included, does not want another victim of crime in the process of seeking justice. I don't want that. I would like to be the only person victimized. I don't want to have somebody else in that club with me. So this is really hard, but I ask, why are we presented with a false choice over and over again about which victims are more important to elevate? Absolutely not. We have addressed a number of policies in the Law and Justice Committee that address things like catalytic converter theft, auto theft, all of the range of issues that we're talking about today. There are a number of ways that we can get at this issue. But I ask why we don't cry for all the victims. I do. There is a particular person that has been responding incessantly on all of the different, social media accounts that have gone on to spread misinformation and disinformation about this policy. And she constantly, she's like, what about my family? What about my child that was killed in a pursuit? What about me? Nobody comments, nobody likes her remarks, and yet she continues to do it. And I follow her, and I reached out to her, and I said, I care. We had a member of this body last year that talked about how he had had a family member close to him that was an innocent bystander, struck in a pursuit. I think he cares very deeply about that family member, Mr. President. We talk about business and property crimes. I have family who own a business in downtown Tacoma. And my cousin asks, what about the data related to the damage that high-speed chases cause to businesses and to properties? Who pays for that? And I wanted to offer, Mr. President, I supported a bill out of Law and Justice because I believe that when you flee, you should be apprehended, point blank. But we know that there is technology, and there's technology in the bill that I voted for, that would allow us to do that and shows that it works in Redmond, in Spokane, and other areas that have restricted pursuit policies. There is technology that allows us to find and apprehend individuals without harming the public. Why are we not having that conversation? That keeps law enforcement safe, that keeps individuals safe, bystanders safe, and it still actually results in a higher rate of apprehension of individuals. And in fact, if used well, it can actually lead to apprehending more individuals involved in criminal activity. And that's been a unifying conversation. I've talked to people who are more conservative in my district, and because of what they've heard, frankly, from I'll just say it, at Pierce County Sheriff's Facebook page, they were confused about the pursuit policy in our town. And I said, we've always had a restrictive pursuit policy. Let me tell you what I supported. And they said, great, yeah, absolutely. Put a location dart on that car and find that vehicle. We agree. So I just want to offer that there are effective tools. And we should be looking at them. We have the technology, we have the ability to do that, but we should not present a false choice between victims. Who is more deserving? All victims should be considered, and that's why I support technology to do this. And I believe that this body is going to move forward with some of that technology to provide that resource. And I'm happy because I think that bill pushed that conversation. But to me, I have to vote no on this bill because this is a false choice to me. We can do better. We have the ability to do better. And as a person who's been a victim of crime, I stand with all victims, and I don't want any more, not one more. Thank you, Mr. President.
Further remarks? Senator Dozier.
Thank you, Mr. President. First of all, I'd like to thank the sponsor, Senator Lovick, for bringing this bill forward. I think it's very important that he saw we had a bad bill from 2 years ago. I'd also like to thank him for his 31 years of service that he has in law enforcement, along with Senator Holy, who had 25 years in service. Thank you for what you do for us. It's very important, I think, that we understand that these law enforcement officers are out there protecting us, the innocent people, and also those that are those committing crimes. They put their lives in danger, but they don't want to have other lives hurt. This bill is better than what we had. When I spoke to the law enforcement officers and the police chief, they said anything will help. Then we talked more about the potential amendments that were brought up. Those were very, very important amendments for this bill to give them more tools. They are highly trained. There are times when they have to make split-second decisions to stop something, and other times, as in the case of a pursuit, they may pursue and then they know that it's too dangerous and they stop. I will put my faith in law enforcement that they would do the right thing. Mr. President, though the bill is better, I can't support the bill without those amendments. So I'm going to be voting no today on this bill.
Further remarks? Senator Hawkins.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm very thankful this bill is before us. I am grateful for the good debates that we had. I'm very proud of our side for offering reasonable and technically sound amendments. And there's also been some very good speeches just recently, and so I would like to acknowledge a couple of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle. So Senator Mullet, I think, made some very courageous remarks, and he talked about incremental progress, and I appreciate what he said. I agree that this is incremental progress. Unfortunately, I do feel it's a bit of 3 steps back, but only 1 step forward, but I'm thankful we're taking the step forward. I'd also like to thank Senator Rivers, and I think she said it best when she said, anything is better than what we have now. And even though I'm a bit conflicted on this bill, for that reason, I'm going to vote yes. Thank you.
Further remarks? Senator Nobles.
Thank you, Mr. President. Fear is how I believe we got here, and hope is what causes me to rise today. I have heard from a number of people that the fear that has been instilled in them from our local law enforcement is what causes them to absolutely believe that the laws that we passed in 2021 are not working. What I hope is that we can trust ourselves as leaders. I also hope that we can trust that we still need more data so that we can understand the benefits and the real costs associated with pursuits. We do have some data. We do know that the bill is working because lives have been saved. And my colleagues have pointed out quite a few pieces of data today, but I would like to take a moment to honor some of the lives of innocent bystanders, lives that were lost because of dangerous pursuits. And before I get there, I do want to acknowledge that there are lots of crimes. In fact, there's a list of violent crimes that should result in a vehicular pursuit. But crimes like misdemeanors and property crimes, we do need to make sure that we are placing the value on human life, Mr. President. And so I today want to make sure that I get to lift up, mention this, Mr. President, but the student, Johnavy, who we lost out of Seattle, 23 years old, a pedestrian from Port Orchard who survived but was injured. Mr. President, Senator Trudeau mentioned my district, which is why I will be a no vote today, because my district is overrepresented in the data that says that these pursuits are causing harm to residents like mine in the 28th Legislative District. But a 43-year-old who was actually trying to help and be a really good citizen was pinned by a car and lost their life. I also want to take a moment to honor the life of a 64-year-old father from Skagit County who lost his life. And another individual from my district in the 28th, a 33-year-old who lost his life in the driveway of his house. And a 32-year-old daughter and sister who was an innocent passenger and lost her life to a vehicular pursuit. And a married couple, 54-year-old woman and 54-year-old man. And I've been married before and I know how that goes. But they lost their lives. A beautiful couple. And so I want us to keep in mind that we did a good thing when we said that this tool of vehicular pursuit doesn't work for every circumstance and every situation. And I agree with some of the remarks earlier of the use of technology. There are ways to pursue that don't need to involve a vehicle so that we can solve crimes, because I don't want anyone to be victimized. I do want crimes to be solved in our community. And I also want to acknowledge that it is a false choice, and it is simply unfair that we have had for a couple of years now this fight, this tension, that we've been pitted against law enforcement as legislators who are standing as caring leaders, Mr. President. And it's especially unfortunate because my own father served as a law enforcement officer. My good friend serves as a law enforcement officer. I have a cousin that is also an officer. And in fact, the other thing as we talk about data is law enforcement is actually not on the same page as it relates to vehicular pursuits. Law enforcement in and out of our state will tell you the absolute truth, which is vehicular pursuits for the types of crimes that we are advocating, well, not me, that some folks are advocating, Mr. President, to put back in this bill, are an inappropriate response. We don't need to have vehicular pursuits for misdemeanors and property crimes because we have enough tools in our toolkits. I've had local chiefs tell me they're not on the same page as folks who are using fear. Again, that's how we got here, to these new changes to this bill. Fear, telling people that our law enforcement can't do their jobs because of the changes that we made, when in fact that they can. There are so many tools that they get to use. So because I'm hopeful that we're going to stand by the decision that we made, because this bill is working, because lives are being saved, because we place value on human life, because we know people are more valuable than property, and because also we know we simply need even more data about the costs and the benefits of pursuits, I will be a no vote, and I stand here hopeful that many more of my colleagues, Mr. President, will also vote no on this bill. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator Braun.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. Well, I would characterize this bill as a half step in the right direction, but not nearly sufficient to address the challenges we have in our state. And I genuinely appreciate the courage of the folks in the majority who stood up today and demanded this bill be pulled up and considered on the floor. That's a big move, and I deeply appreciate this. And I understand that that causes some division over there. But this bill isn't there yet. We have lawlessness in our streets, and this bill is not going to fix that. It does not go far enough. We offered 3 amendments, Mr. President. I thought they were reasonable, straightforward, sound amendments. And what we got in response was, as I said earlier, we got hyperbole versus understanding versus listening. We got the claim that you could only protect human life or property. Those aren't mutually exclusive. In fact, as we heard, Mr. President, often when we have theft of property, we hurt people. We had claims that we have to use data, yet we had data misrepresented. We know, Mr. President, not because anybody in this room, even anybody on our staff said, we have an independent evaluation of the effect on innocent lives of this law over the last 2 years, and it is statistically unknown. We don't know, Mr. President. And you can put that as a percentage. That doesn't mean it meaningful. The numbers are too small. They're too sporadic. They do not tell us anything. That doesn't come from me. That doesn't come from anyone on the floor. That doesn't come from our staff. It comes from a university researcher that does this for a living, that understands that it's not telling us anything. So we should have an honest conversation, Mr. President. We should use data, but we should use it the right way. Don't cherry pick. The idea that somehow if you read the Washington Auto Theft Prevention chart and say auto thefts increased starting in 2020, well, I'll give you the data, I'll give you the chart, Mr. President. I challenge you to read that and come to that conclusion. That's not what it says. As with many charts like that, there's a lot of ziggity lines, but if you fare through that and look at that, you see a decided increase from the time that bill was passed in 2021. Any reasonable person that looks at that chart would say so. We have this claim, well, hey, there's been more deaths than there were caused by lightning, hurricanes, and floods. 3 highly, notoriously, difficult things to quantify. I've lived through 3 100-year floods in the last 25 years in my district. 1 person has died during that entire time. We use lightning as a euphemism for things that happen very infrequently, and yet we make that comparison and claim we're working with data. That's just not right, Mr. President. That's not an honest conversation. We've been talking about technology. We should use more technology. We got to get to the 21st century. Well, I certainly appreciate that, and I think there has merit, but let's be clear. The city of Redmond is doing it. The most affluent region in our state can afford to do it. But much of the rest of the state cannot. This is not a goal that is anytime immediately achievable by the vast majority of our state, and yet that is supposed to be the solution. We say, hey, we're going to just have folks follow up. But the truth is, Mr. President, we don't have enough officers to do that. We are the lowest in the country. 51 out of 50 states, because DC also beats us by a good margin, and we lost another 500 officers last year. There's no follow-up. Our law enforcement officers are already working at their capacity, well beyond their capacity in many cases, and we think, well, we can just follow up and we'll write the license plate number and we'll go find them. No, that's not going to happen. Lawlessness is going to continue. That's what's going to happen, Mr. President. So we have a bill. It moves us in the right direction. Not as far as I would like, clearly further than others would like. But it is going to keep it alive. It continues down this path of insisting on probable cause in many situations. And I want to remind you, Mr. President, we are the only state in the country, 1 state out of 50, that uses probable cause. Everybody else uses reasonable suspicion, just like we did in all cases prior to 2021. So I think it's a little bold to say somehow we got it right and every other state in the country got it wrong, when we are seeing crime increases that others are not. Mr. President, I think we're going to get this bill out of here today, and I think that's a good thing. I think it's good to keep it alive. I think it's got more work to do. I've said all along on some tough issues we have before us this session. We have to trust the process. Democracy has to work. We have to take every opportunity we can to make our case to improve the bill, to give the people of Washington the policy they deserve. I don't think we're there today, but we got to keep trying. We must do better. Thank you, Mr. President.
If there are no further remarks, the question before the Senate is final passage of engrossed Senate Bill 5352. The Secretary will call the roll.
Billig. Binky. Binky. Braun. Cleveland. Conway. Dhingra. Dhingra. Dozier. Fortunado. Frame. Gildon. Gildon. Masagawa. Hawkins. Holy. Hunt. Kaufman. Kaiser. King. King. Cooterer. Cooterer. Leas. Lovelet. Lovick. Mccune Drew. Mccune Drew. Mccune Jim. Mccune Jim. Mullet. Muzzall. Aye. Wen. Nobles. No. Padden. No. Peterson. No. Randall. Rivers. Aye. Robinson. Aye. Rolfes. Aye. Saldana. No. Solomon. Aye. Chesler. No. Shoemake. Aye. Short. No. Danford. No. Horace. Aye. Trudeau. No. Valdez. No. Vandeweghe. Aye. Wagoner. No. Warnick. No. Wellman. Aye. Wilson Claire. No. Wilson Jeff. Aye. Wilson Lynda. Wilson Lynda.
Senator Binky, how do you vote?
Binky votes no.
Binky votes, Senator Binky votes no. Senator Dhingra, how do you vote? Senator Dhingra votes aye. Senator Braun, how do you vote? Aye. Senator Braun votes aye. Senator King, how do you vote? Votes aye. Senator King votes aye. Senator Gildon, how do you vote? Votes aye. Senator Gildon votes aye. Senator Mccune, how do you vote? Aye. Senator Mccune votes aye. Senator Mccune, how do you vote? No. Senator Mccune votes no. Senator Wynn, how do you vote?
We vote no.
Senator Wynn votes no. Senator Randall, how do you vote?
Votes aye.
Senator Randall votes aye. Senator Braun?
No.
Senator Braun changes from aye to no. Senator Hunt?
Changes to no.
Senator Hunt changes from aye to no. Okay.
Mr. President, there are 26 yea, 23 nay.
Having received a constitutional majority, and Gross Senate Bill 5352 is declared passed. The title of the bill will be the title of the act.